Dale Pinkert here from TradeGateHub.com, powered by TradeView Markets, and I have the pleasure of being joined by my go-to geopolitical and almost everything else on the planet, Harald Malmgren. You could follow him on Twitter at Hal's Rethink. Great to be able to see you, and thanks for being with us today, Harald.
Well, it's my pleasure, Dale. I've talked with you on audio for several times now, so we're almost old buddies, but I haven't seen you, so this is a pleasure.
I know. So, the romance grows. I felt we dated, we dated long enough to be able to see each other. Anyway, so great to see your face, and I want to get serious now about how there was destiny or providence that you were involved in with the Kennedy administration during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I wonder if you could just kind of tell our viewers what that was like for you, the build up to it, how they called you in, and the advice you gave during that most critical time period in global history.
Well, it's a story that can go on, but I was an academic teaching at Cornell, and I got a call from the White House from George Bundy, who was the national security advisor to Jack Kennedy. And he said, "Hal, we want you to come to Washington." And I said, "Yeah, well, that's nice, but I'm busy here." And he said, "No, we need you. We want you to be the liaison between Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and me." And I said, "That sounds pretty exciting." He said, "Just do it." And several other people then called me, and next thing you know, by the summer of '62, I was in Washington and working at the Pentagon, but with the White House on a daily basis. And then out of nowhere came the Cuban Missile Crisis. Jack Kennedy and Bobby and McNamara and various others were in the White House arguing, discussing, trying to read the minds of the Russians. I was posted to what's called the war room, where the generals would sit down and decide when the moment came, if we're going to do something with the Russians, what we would do, targeting what we would hit or who we would hit. Pretty exciting. And for several days, it was really uncertain, but at the final moments, before the Russians balked and stopped, a ship that was heading for the quarantine, we thought we were within hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours, of pushing the button on something. Do we hit Cuba first, but assumed that the Russians would send some intercontinental missiles to the US? And if so, how do we anticipate, and what should we strike in the Soviet Union? The popular misconception when you're a picker like that is that everybody would fire everything and there would be mutual destruction. But actually, when you get to that moment of that kind of decision, sanity does prevail. I was charged with, I was the junior guy there by age, but I was charged with asking questions, making everybody rethink. And so I began with, if we assume that they won't fire everything at us, then probably we should not fire everything at them. We should have some way of talking to them after whatever bad thing happens. And everybody say, yeah, we haven't considered that. We've only considered all-out mutual destruction. But I said, nobody's that insane. So maybe we should tell them we're not going to hit Moscow, and then they will probably reply, okay, we won't hit Washington. So at least we'll be around to talk to them. It was interesting at that moment. One of the generals got up and said, gentlemen, let me go out of the room. I got to call my wife and tell her she can come home.
Oh, huh. How about
So
that?
we were that close. Everybody had their families sent away from Washington. And we had a standby government being formed to go out to Mount Weather in a mountain near where I live now. But then I said, look, probably if we get in something dramatic, most likely it's going to be selective. We're not going to blow up the world. So we have to decide, are we going to limit the targeting to military facilities in the Soviet Union, or infrastructure, or some imminent threat we see that is limited? And everybody said, well, we've never considered narrowing the targeting down because we always assume we'd blow everything up. And I said, yes, but it doesn't make any sense. So we went round and round thinking through selective action and selective retaliation, and how we meet to stop if something bad happens.
That is so interesting. And really, up until 30 seconds ago, what it made me think of is the way that Putin looks at nuclear weapons, at both first strike and tactical. And I think that most of the general public, including myself until I talked to you about this today, thought that was the way the generals were thinking, that it was an all or none game. And, you know, there's almost some security in that, all or none, because how much, you know, someone would really have to be, like you said, insane. But to be able to use them in a different way where we could have nuclear events, but not blow up the whole world at once, almost makes it seem like it's more, you know, it could be more practical.
Well, I learned a lot, of course, in that highly intense days, actually the final hours. But later, some years later, 1992, I was introduced in St. Petersburg. I was introduced to Putin, met with him, talked with him. It was 7 years before he became president.
Okay.
And had dinner with him, got to know him. And then I saw that near the end of President Yeltsin's time, Putin was called to Moscow to become the secretary of the State Security Council, something like our National Security Council in Washington. And there he, over 2.5 years, it seems he studied nuclear war inside out, upside down.
Yeah. And
came up with this theory of his own called Escalate to Deescalate. In other words, do something limited to force the great powers to get together and resolve the situation. And our press hasn't really caught on to this. This is not just a way of bluffing. It's deep in his thinking. So I would have to say his thinking is not very different from the kind of thinking I was enmeshed in 1962.
That's what I mean. Yeah. So, you know, a lot of people, would, consider, and I believe that Putin would use nukes tactically during this war or operation, or to rebuild Peter the Great's empire. Do you believe that he will unleash a tactical nuke? I know you were months ahead of time, but since you know him, which I didn't know that, you said he would invade. So will he use a nuke?
I think that he's somebody who really calculates. I'm not saying he's a genius, but he's obviously given more thought to this than any U.S. leader we ever had, or
Yeah, decades worth of thought.
Yeah.
That's ingrained.
So when you look at it that way, I can imagine at some point, if he wants to force the U.S. to sit down with the Russians and create some new security blanket, that he might use a tactical nuclear weapon, or maybe 2 or 3, as a way of forcing us to a head. Because if he did that, we'd have to ask, is this the beginning? And he would probably reply, no, there is an option here. We don't have to be suicidal, but we do have to talk. So I think we cannot assume he's going to avoid this at all costs. On the contrary, if he thinks it's the right moment, he will do it in order to get us out of our comfort zone in Washington to a table somewhere in the world.
That would get President Biden's attention, definitely, or whoever is president. So let me ask you this. You were in Washington during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and administration, reaches out to you or not, but if you're in the room with Biden and his Defense Department, what are you telling them now?
Well, I have talked to a number of different people, but it's my judgment that Biden doesn't have knowledge of this area, this strategic equilibrium, and the people around him are, shall I say, inexperienced and not so eager to spend time talking to the military. I believe there is very limited discussion between the State Department and the White House and our military. There is talk with Secretary of Defense Austin, but he is, from his years of experience, he is not a battlefield
warrior. He's an administrator. Right?
The generals, I'm pretty interactive even now with the military, and they consider him a peacetime general.
Okay.
He knows how to take care of the officers' quarters and the families of the officers, and make sure the meals are delivered for the troops. The fuel gets where it's supposed to be, but in under fire confrontation, his colleagues do not look to him for advice. They look to him as a corporate executive would look to the head of the accounting department.
Gosh.
Don't stop, keep counting, and leave me alone.
Okay. So doesn't that make us pretty vulnerable to someone who's so much more experienced and has been thinking and planning something for decades, imagined it, visualized it? Where are we going, Harold? What do you think the outcome of this is going to be?
Yes and no. I worry about what would be necessary if there were ultimately a high-level meeting to calm things down. But when I look practically at what's going on, there's a story that the press hasn't really talked about. You know well that the Nordic countries, Poland, Belgium, Netherlands, have formed a defensive group using our US F-35 aircraft as a kind of integrated force. The UK is deeply involved. It's sort of part of NATO, partly it isn't NATO. But that group is not flying wild. They are under the command of the US Navy Second Fleet. Now, what is the Second Fleet? Second Fleet is, we have, the Pacific Fleet, we have the Mediterranean oriented fleet, but the Second Fleet is basically oriented towards the Arctic, the Baltic Sea area, and down to the Black Sea where Ukraine is. And that Second Fleet is actually managed under the command of Admiral Woody Lewis in Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Virginia.
So that's their crack unit. That's their elite unit. Am I right?
And they are really the strategy people behind what the U.S. is doing with that region, and they, these are all Annapolis graduates who have a lot of history in their education. They're the best of the best of any of our academies, and I found them to be totally reasonable, sensible, and accident avoidance oriented. So I'm not so worried about the military. I'm more worried about the civilian side of this.
Okay, and what are those?
Yeah, well, once you get to a higher level, before this blew up, I did say in writing several places, including on Twitter, that the US should accept the invitation of Putin to have a high-level meeting on reviewing post-World War II security. The Biden people didn't see any point to it. They shunned the idea. I did say to some of them, yeah, it would be a 2 or 3 years of talking, maybe getting nowhere, but it would avoid invasion of Ukraine. And talking, spending time talking is well worth it if you can avoid death and violence.
Yeah. Yes.
But there was no interest in it. And Putin did offer that approach several times as he built up and prepared for the invasion.
Yeah, you don't hear about that in the press, Harold.
No.
About all the efforts that Putin made to, not go this way. I mean, I didn't know there were several attempts by Putin to, Huh.
Well,
Disappointing.
I have a long history of dealing with the Soviet Union. As you know, I've been involved in a lot of things around the world for a lot of years, but with regard to the Soviets, I was interactive with them during the Cold War. I had a reputation with them of being somebody who never sought the spotlight, could trust for private discussions and calming when necessary. So when this was all blowing up, I was getting feelers from Moscow from a very high level about other people we can talk to besides Biden in the Congress or in the public. And I did some exploration, but there was a resistance. As I say, from lack of experience, the attitude was, why do we have to worry about the Russians? They're a spent force. We have other things on our mind. We got a domestic agenda. We have upcoming elections.
Oh, yeah,
we
of
got
course.
these
Yeah. Well,
devil
that's
Chinese.
number one, right? That's number one. The
It's always
midterms.
number one.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, I've worked with several presidents. I've been informally very interactive with several others. And always, even when the president personally was interested in world affairs, Nixon definitely was, Reagan, Bush 41, all deeply interested in world affairs. But whenever any key question came up, then the political people would say, how does it play in our next by-election or next election? It's always an overriding concern.
Yeah.
We have an ocean on each side of America, and it's just the mindset is stuff that's far away is not relevant to the next vote.
Yeah. Ignorance is not bliss. I'd like to wrap it with staying geo. But your thoughts about the deterioration of the US and China relationship and Biden actually coming out saying that we would defend Taiwan if they were attacked by China.
Yeah. Look, China has become a massive problem, no question. And I think the problems with China were opened up. As you know, I'm not partisan between the parties. I've always tried to be a problem solver for the country. But the problems really opened up in an unplanned and without thought manner by Bill Clinton when he invited the Chinese into the World Trade Organization and said, look, just come on in. We don't need elaborate negotiations. And the theory was,
just come on in and have a beer.
Yeah, and then they will prosper and they'll become like us, was the theory, and we'll all get along.
Yeah.
And it was very foolish.
Yeah.
Anyway, and our businesses, they were all really primarily focused on that huge market in China, thinking we can sell stuff there, sell lots of cars, sell lots of gadgets, sell our software, sell everything, maybe sell our businesses. And we had, this wave of outsourcing, and got ourselves deeply involved with China in ways that Chinese could exploit. But now, I think that has now changed. China is now really starting about 2 years ago in a problem that is very much like Japan at the end of the 80s when their bubble burst. China does not have strong domestic demand.
Okay.
The wages haven't
Lockdowns
really
don't help either, do they? Their COVID policy.
No, all of that, confusion, the pandemic, and the supply chain problems in the ports, all of these things. But underlying, China became dependent on exports, and the export surplus was the engine of domestic growth. But I think you may have seen in the last few days, Germany's export surplus, which includes exporting to China, dropped to negative. In other words, Germany, one of the world's most export-oriented economies, suddenly finds itself with no buyers. And the same thing is happening in China. New orders for Chinese stuff, whether it's components, sub-assemblies, or final products, have dried up. There is an industrial contraction going on worldwide, and the biggest exporters or manufacturers are caught in this. Which are they? There's Japan, South Korea, China, and Germany. And they are all going to suffer a sudden problem of no exports, and so therefore they have to grow from within. And with China, it's almost impossible for them to grow right now. In fact, I think the few really good Chinese experts I know would say they face 10 years at least of no growth.
Wow.
So
because no growth to them is 7% GDP is slow growth.
Yeah, I think they'll always falsify the numbers, but I think we're going to see growth in China for the next several years at near zero.
Wow, that's a big call, Harold.
Yeah, well, I'm not dreaming this. I've really been looking at it for a lot of years, and I was deeply involved with Japan when they were, everybody was worried that Japanese were going to
take over the world.
Our companies and all our skyscrapers in New York.
When they bought Rockefeller Tower, wasn't that the top?
Yeah, and a good friend of mine at Harvard put out a book, Japan is #1. I told him he was insane. I said, this will collapse, and it did. And I think the same thing has happened to China. They ran this up as far as they could, and now it's come to a halt.
Okay, how about here in the US now, Harold? We got a few minutes. Have you ever seen a time period where you have all these signs of potential negative global industrial growth? The consumer's still holding up, I think, until they get their bills from the summer for their vacations. And the Fed is still tightening. What if you could talk to Paul, what would you tell him?
Well, Biden and Janet Yellen and Powell have just continued saying there's no recession in sight.
Yeah,
everything is fine. Labor market's strong.
Tight, yeah, right.
And what I've been seeing is the beginning of industrial contraction. Now, let me go back, because everybody forgets when the pandemic hit. Just before the pandemic hit, in the second half of 2019, the world was entering synchronized industrial slowdown.
Right.
And what hid the problem was that pandemic resulted in massive amount of fiscal stimulus.
Right.
Just poured money everywhere. And for 2 years, we were living on artificial
stimulus.
Yeah. Now that ran out. Congress is approaching an election. Republicans are not going to agree to any more stimulus that might help the Democrats. Democrats are going to try to blame the Republicans, but nobody's going to do anything. So, but what's happening is we're back to where we were, with huge, biggest inventories of almost everything that's physical, raw materials all the way to end products, including cars. Biggest inventories we've ever experienced. And now we've got the biggest wave of absence of any new orders and lots of cancellations of orders. So the gap between what we could produce and what's in demand is mammoth. So we are starting with an industrial downturn. It began and it's visible in the first quarter. I think the second quarter it's going to be negative again, but I don't think it's over then. I think it's going to go all year and get deeper. And then it will spread to the jobs market, and it will spread to services. A lot of the people who were part of the great resignation, retiring, saying, that's it, I'm going home.
They'll have to go back to work.
We're going to have the unretired coming back to work, and lots of the wives who decide they like looking after the kids at home will go back to work because they can't meet ends
Yeah.
with this inflation, which is much faster than wage increases.
Right.
So we are in a recession. The bright side is we're coming into it earlier than Europe and Asia. And we'll come out of it earlier than Europe and Asia for a simple reason that almost all the macroeconomists forecasts overlook. And that is when there are a lot of wealthy people and wealthy companies, wealthy sovereign wealth funds all over the world now. And that money is going to go to whatever looks like it's the safest place. And everything's going to look really bad in Europe and Asia or Latin America.
We're the best dirty shirt.
That's right. We're going to have a lot of money pouring into the US, and it'll initially go into the bond market for safety, and then it will spin outwards to our credit markets. So I'm not worried about the US. I think we come out of this, and I'm very hopeful about all the new technologies that we can explore. There is an industrial revolution in the making now. So we're going to have a rough year. But for everybody else, it's going to be a rough 2 or 3 or maybe more years. I think Europe especially is vulnerable because Europe has been living off the export engine of Germany for decades. And that export engine is now kaput.
Yeah, through a rod, cracked the head. And you know, Harold, this was the best interview we ever did together. And I really always learned from you so much. I appreciate your time and your giving spirit to share, you know, your life experience with our community and people on Twitter and all over the place. You're a rare diamond in my view. Thank you, Harold.
It's the story of my life. And I mean, I got called into things I never expected to be involved in, but I always like to look at the constructive side. When we had all this race of industry to outsource everything to China, and the Japanese were trying to figure out what to do, I spent a lot of time with Toyota, and I said, why fret? Yes, it's true, a lot of US companies are outsourcing, but if you move more production inside the US, there's a huge opportunity. And I guided them and some other Japanese companies. And if you look today, about 20 or 30 years later, Toyota is now the world's biggest auto company and one of the most important in the US. So it's been this kind of process of trying to find solutions where everybody's looking so narrowly at what the difficulties are of the moment.
I wish you could give a transfusion to our country so that instead of us being partisans, that we became problem solvers like you.
Yeah,
Harold.
That's what's missing.
All right. Well, thank you for being a breath of fresh air and really and sharing your life story with us. And like I said before we began, very grateful to Twitter that our paths crossed.
It's turned out for me to be a way of communicating very concisely my observations on what's going on, and somehow it's got to follow me.
Follow Harold at Hal's Rethink and go to his website and read his research and stay in touch with someone who's still really wired in and is not bashful to share it with the world. Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, nice to see you as well.
Yeah, no, we'll be talking again soon.
Yeah.
Have a great summer, buddy.
You too. Thanks.
All right. Harold Mal